What if everything we've been taught about human evolution was backwards? What if the moment we became truly human wasn't when we started changing, but when we stopped? In the quiet vaults of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, where fluorescent lights hum against reinforced walls and temperature-controlled chambers preserve fragments of ancient bone, a peculiar dataset whispers something impossible. Beneath layers of statistical analysis and DNA sequencing, beneath the careful language of peer-reviewed journals, the numbers tell a story that shouldn't exist. Around 200,000 years ago, something happened to human DNA. Something that defies every principle of evolutionary biology we hold sacred. Picture yourself holding a single strand of your own hair. Inside that hair, coiled within microscopic chambers, lies your mitochondrial DNA. 15,000 base pairs. A tiny genetic archive passed down exclusively through mothers. Now imagine tracing that thread backwards through time. Through your mother. Through her mother. Through 10,000 grandmothers stretching into the darkness of prehistory. The thread never breaks. It leads you back, inevitably, impossibly, to a woman who lived in East Africa roughly 200,000 years ago. Geneticists call her mitochondrial Eve, though she was never alone and never knew her descendants would name the world. Here's what makes this strange. Every other species on Earth shows genetic diversity that branches like a tree, spreading outward through millions of years. But humans? We're different. Our genetic tree looks more like a telephone pole with a few branches at the very top. All 7 billion of us trace back to a population that geneticist Dr. Rebecca Cann of the University of Hawaii estimated in her landmark 1987 study to be perhaps as small as 10,000 breeding individuals. Think about that. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, show 4 times more genetic diversity despite having a fraction of our population size. A single troop of chimpanzees in West Africa can harbor more genetic variation than exists in the entire human species. The orthodox explanation goes like this. Homo sapiens arose in Africa between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago through gradual evolutionary processes. Small founding populations migrated outward. Genetic drift occurred. We lost diversity naturally through isolation and adaptation. The story is neat, logical, supported by decades of paleoanthropological evidence from sites like Omo Kaibish in Ethiopia and Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. But the numbers don't work. In 2013, a team led by Dr. Xiaomei Fu at the Max Planck Institute sequenced mitochondrial DNA from ancient human remains spanning 40,000 years of European prehistory. Their paper, published in Current Biology, revealed something unexpected. Ancient humans carried genetic lineages that no longer exist in modern populations. Entire branches of the human family tree simply vanished. Not gradually, not through slow genetic drift, but in what appears to be a series of sharp truncations. The genetic diversity present in humans 40,000 years ago was measurably higher than it is today. We aren't slowly accumulating variation as evolutionary theory predicts. We're losing it. Dr. Henry Harpending of the University of Utah spent decades analyzing human genetic patterns. Before his death in 2016, he published research showing that human populations underwent repeated bottlenecks, periods where breeding populations crashed to critically low numbers. These weren't gradual declines. They were catastrophic collapses. The evidence appears in what geneticists call coalescent theory, the mathematical framework for tracing lineages backward to common ancestors. Human DNA shows what Harpending called an extreme lack of variation compared to other great apes, suggesting our species squeezed through an evolutionary bottleneck so narrow that it should have driven us to extinction. Which brings us to the real question. What could reduce a successful, geographically widespread species to fewer breeding individuals than a modern small town, and do it repeatedly across hundreds of thousands of years? Before we go further, if you enjoy stories where human origins refuse to make sense, consider subscribing. And if you're listening in the dark somewhere, drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I want to picture this mystery stretching across time zones while you drift toward sleep. The pattern repeats everywhere we look. Y-chromosomal Adam, the patrilineal ancestor of all living males, lived between 180,000 and 260,000 years ago according to research published in 2013 by Stanford geneticist Dr. Carlos Bustamante. For decades, scientists thought mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosomal Adam lived tens of thousands of years apart, which would suggest complex population dynamics. But revised dating places them in roughly the same time frame. Same bottleneck. Same mysterious collapse. Both maternal and paternal lineages point to a moment in deep time when humanity balanced on the edge of extinction. In the lowlands of northwest Ethiopia, at an archaeological site designated Shinfamatima 1, excavations revealed something that complicates this picture further. Stone tools and evidence of human occupation dated to 74,000 years ago, right in the middle of what should have been a catastrophic population collapse. The Toba supervolcano had just erupted in Sumatra, ejecting 2,800 cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the stratosphere, enough to lower global temperatures by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius for years. Anthropologist Stanley Ambrose of the University of Illinois proposed in 1998 that Toba created a volcanic winter severe enough to reduce human populations to fewer than 10,000 individuals worldwide. The Toba catastrophe theory, as it became known, seemed to explain the genetic bottleneck perfectly. Except humans in Ethiopia survived, thrived, even. The stone tools at Shinfamatima 1 show no disruption in technology or cultural continuity. No mass die-off. No desperate struggle for survival. People adapted. They endured. But their DNA still shows a bottleneck. Which means the collapse happened despite successful adaptation, despite stable populations, despite evidence of continuity. The cause lies somewhere deeper than environmental catastrophe, deeper than volcanic winters or ice ages or any external force we can measure in geological strata. Something impossible appears in the genetics of our species. Pause that shouldn't exist. A stasis in the very machinery of evolution itself. In a quiet museum archive at the Natural History Museum in London, late at night when the fluorescent lights dim and the building settles into silence, there's a drawer in the molecular biology collections labeled with a catalog number few people would recognize. Inside that drawer, suspended in preservative solution, float samples of great ape DNA collected over the past century. Gorilla, orangutan, bonobo, chimpanzee, and human. Under spectroscopic analysis, these samples reveal something unsettling. The mutation rate in great ape DNA proceeds like clockwork, accumulating changes at a predictable pace that allows geneticists to use DNA as a molecular clock. Approximately 1 mutation per billion base pairs per year. Steady. Reliable. Except in humans where the rate appears to have slowed. Dr. Philip Awadala and colleagues at the University of Montreal published research in 2020 documenting what they termed evolution of the mutation rate across primates. Their data showed converging evidence from multiple analytical approaches that humans experienced a mutation rate slowdown compared to other great apes. Not a subtle difference. A measurable deceleration in the fundamental rate at which our DNA changes over time. This shouldn't happen. Mutation rates are determined by biochemical processes in cell replication, errors in DNA polymerase, damage from background radiation, copying mistakes during cell division. These processes don't care about species. They don't respond to population size or environmental pressure. They're mechanical, inevitable, yet somehow in the human lineage they slowed. The implications sprawl in uncomfortable directions. If mutation rates slowed, then our molecular clocks are wrong. The dates we've assigned to human evolution, the timelines we've constructed for migrations out of Africa, the neat progression from archaic to modern humans, all of it requires recalibration. A paper published in 2016 in bioarchive by researchers at the University of Cambridge examined whether this slowdown was recent or ancient. Their conclusion? The great ape mutation rate declined during the evolution of the hominid lineage, but there's no clear evidence for a more recent change within the timescale of modern human evolution. The slowdown happened deeper in time, before we were fully human, which makes the genetic bottleneck at 200,000 years ago even more mysterious because it can't be explained by changing mutation rates alone. Think about what mutation means for a moment. Every time a cell divides, DNA must be copied. 3 billion base pairs duplicated with astonishing precision. But precision isn't perfection. Mistakes slip through. Cosmic rays damage nucleotides. Chemical reactions spontaneously alter molecular structures. These mutations are the raw material of evolution. Without them, populations can't adapt, can't change, can't respond to environmental challenges. A species with a slowed mutation rate should struggle to evolve, should find itself locked into existing genetic patterns, vulnerable to changing conditions. Yet humans exploded across the planet. We colonized every terrestrial biome from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests to desert highlands. We developed culture, language, technology, art. We became the most adaptable large mammal in Earth's history. How does a species with reduced genetic variation and a slowed mutation rate accomplish that? The answer lies in what we don't find. Paleoanthropological sites from 200,000 years ago are frustratingly sparse. We have fragments. Skull bones from Homo kaibish, fragmentary remains from Hertoburi, isolated teeth from caves in Morocco. But we don't have populations. We don't have cemeteries. We don't have the kind of dense archaeological record that would let us reconstruct demographic patterns with confidence. The people who lived through the bottleneck period left almost no trace. Not because they weren't there, but because there were so few of them that the statistical likelihood of preservation approaches zero. Dr. Alan R. Rogers, a geneticist at the University of Utah, spent years developing statistical models to extract population history from DNA sequences. His research, refined over dozens of papers, suggests that human populations were structured into small, partially isolated groups for most of the past 500,000 years. These groups occasionally exchanged genes but remained largely separate. This fragmentation would accelerate genetic drift, the random loss of genetic variants that happens in small populations. Each isolated group would lose different variants. When groups occasionally mixed, some diversity would be restored, but the overall pattern would be one of continual genetic erosion punctuated by brief moments of recovery. This explains the pattern, but it doesn't explain the cause. Why would a successful species fragment into tiny, isolated populations? What prevented them from expanding, from maintaining large breeding populations that would preserve genetic diversity? Climate records from ice cores drilled in Antarctica and Greenland show repeated glacial cycles during the Middle Pleistocene, the period from 800,000 to 125,000 years ago. Each glacial advance would have restricted habitable zones, forcing populations into isolated refugia. But glacial cycles affected all African species, not just humans. Baboons didn't lose genetic diversity. Neither did elephants or antelope or any of the other large mammals that shared our habitat. Only humans show this peculiar genetic signature. Here's what makes this strange. Around the same time human genetic diversity collapsed, something else changed. Brain size in Homo sapiens stabilized. For 2 million years, hominin brain volume had been steadily increasing, from about 600 cubic centimeters in early Homo species to over 1,400 cubic centimeters in Neanderthals and early modern humans. But 200,000 years ago, the increase stopped. Modern human brains average 1,350 cubic centimeters. We're actually slightly smaller brained than Neanderthals were, and measurably smaller than early Homo sapiens specimens like those from Jebel Irhoud. We didn't evolve bigger brains after 200,000 years ago. We evolved different brains. More efficient ones, perhaps. More specialized. But not larger. The coincidence of timing suggests a connection. Genetic bottleneck. Slowed mutation rate. Stabilized brain size. All happening in roughly the same period. All pointing to a fundamental restructuring of what it meant to be human. In archaeological deposits from this period, we find something else that changed. Symbolic behavior appears. Not everywhere, not consistently, but in isolated sites scattered across Africa and the Levant. We find ochre crayons used for decoration, deliberately perforated shells used as beads, abstract engravings on bone and stone. These artifacts represent something qualitatively different from earlier tool use. They're not functional. They're communicative. They suggest minds capable of symbolic thought, of representing abstract concepts of culture. Maybe we've been asking the wrong question. Maybe the genetic bottleneck wasn't something that happened to humans. Maybe it was something we did to ourselves. Picture a single obsidian blade, pressure-flaked to molecular thinness, resting in the palm of someone's hand 200,000 years ago. The person who made this blade understood materials at an intuitive level that required hundreds of hours of practice. They understood heat treatment to improve stone workability. They understood the geometry of force application, the angles and pressures needed to detach flakes with surgical precision. Most importantly, they could teach these skills to others. They could transmit knowledge across generations without genetic change, without waiting for natural selection to favor advantageous mutations. They had culture. This is where human evolution diverges from every other species on Earth. We developed a second inheritance system running parallel to genetics. Cultural evolution, the ability to learn, innovate, and share information socially meant that adaptation no longer required genetic change. A mutation that slightly improved cold tolerance might take thousands of generations to spread through a population. But knowledge of fire, of clothing, of shelter construction could spread in a single generation. Culture made genetics less important. Anthropologist Robert Boyd of Arizona State University has spent decades studying cultural evolution. His research, compiled in numerous books and papers, demonstrates that human cultural adaptations occurred orders of magnitude faster than genetic adaptations. When modern humans migrated into Arctic environments 40,000 years ago, they didn't evolve biological adaptations to cold. They brought tailored clothing, sophisticated hunting technologies, and architectural knowledge that let them construct insulated dwellings. The Inuit peoples who eventually specialized in Arctic survival did so almost entirely through cultural evolution, not genetic change. But here's the thing. Cultural evolution requires social learning. It requires communities large enough and stable enough to maintain and transmit knowledge. It requires contact between groups to spread innovations, all of which should increase population sizes and genetic diversity. Instead, we see the opposite. Right when cultural evolution should have caused human populations to expand and diversify genetically, they contracted and homogenized. Unless culture itself was the bottleneck. Think about what happens when a species develops language, symbolic thought, and complex social structures. Group identity becomes important. In-group versus out-group distinctions emerge. The archaeological record from the Middle Stone Age shows exactly this pattern. Different regions of Africa developed distinct tool technologies, distinct symbolic systems, distinct cultural markers. These differences weren't just random variation. They were maintained across generations, suggesting strong cultural boundaries between groups. Dr. Eleanor Seri at the Max Planck Institute has published extensively on what she calls African multiregionalism. The idea that modern humans didn't evolve in a single location but across multiple interconnected populations spread throughout Africa. Her research, synthesized in papers published in Nature and Trends in Ecology and Evolution, shows that stone tool technologies from 300,000 years ago vary dramatically across the continent. The Acheulean in the east, the Sangoan in central regions, the Middle Stone Age variants spreading through the south. These aren't just different styles. They represent different cultural traditions maintained by populations that had limited genetic exchange despite living on the same continent. Cultural boundaries create genetic boundaries. If populations identify strongly with their own group and rarely interbreed with outsiders, genetic diversity within each group will decline through drift. The overall species maintains diversity across groups, but each individual population becomes more homogeneous. Over time, as some populations go extinct through random demographic fluctuations, their unique genetic variants vanish. The species as a whole becomes less diverse even though total population numbers might remain stable or even increase. This pattern matches exactly what we see in human genetics. Modern African populations contain the most genetic diversity, but that diversity is partitioned geographically. West African populations differ genetically from East African populations, which differ from Southern African populations. The differences aren't large, we're still remarkably homogeneous compared to other species, but they're structured, patterned, suggesting long-term partial isolation maintained by cultural rather than geographic barriers. Which brings us to a darker possibility. What if the genetic bottleneck wasn't accidental? What if it was violence? Archaeological evidence for interpersonal violence in the Middle Stone Age is sparse but suggestive. A skull from Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, dated to approximately 13,000 years ago, shows evidence of violent trauma. Stone projectile points embedded in bones. Defensive injuries on forearms. This is after the main Bottleneck period, but it demonstrates that violent conflict between groups was well within the behavioral repertoire of ancient humans. Primatologist Richard Wrangham has documented lethal intergroup violence in chimpanzees, our closest living relatives. Small coalitions of males patrol territorial boundaries and occasionally kill members of neighboring groups. This behavior appears to be deeply rooted in great ape psychology. Now imagine that behavior combined with human weapons technology. Spears, atlatls, coordinated ambush hunting techniques turned against neighboring groups. Population genetics suggests that when violence is systematic and targeted primarily at males, it creates a specific genetic signature. Reduce diversity in Y chromosome lineages but preserve diversity in mitochondrial lineages. We see exactly the opposite in humans. Both maternal and paternal lineages show severe bottlenecks, which means if violence was involved, it wasn't selective. It was total. Groups being eliminated entirely. This is speculation. We may never know. But the genetic evidence demands an explanation, and environmental factors alone don't seem sufficient. Climate change affects all species in a region, not just one. Disease can create bottlenecks, but diseases that preferentially affect humans shouldn't have existed 200,000 years ago when our populations were small and dispersed. That leaves behavioral explanations, cultural fragmentation, territoriality, conflict. The pattern repeats globally just much later. When anatomically modern humans migrated out of Africa beginning around 70,000 to 60,000 years ago, they encountered other human species. Neanderthals in Europe and West Asia. Denisovans in Central and East Asia. Homo floresiensis in Indonesia. All of these species went extinct within tens of thousands of years after modern human arrival. We hybridized with them. Our DNA carries traces of Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry, proving that interbreeding was possible. But they still vanished. Their populations collapsed while modern human populations expanded into the territories they once exclusively occupied. Was this competition, disease transmission, direct violence, or something more subtle, an economic displacement where modern humans' more efficient technologies and social organizations simply outcompete other human species for resources? We don't know. What we do know is that modern humans have a history of being the only human species left standing. Whatever caused other human species to go extinct, it's something our ancestors were very good at. In the basement archives of the American Museum of Natural History in New York, there's a collection of plaster casts made from fossil hominin skulls. These casts, yellowed with age and labeled with handwritten tags from the early 20th century, represent our species family album. Homo erectus from Java, Homo heidelbergensis from Germany, Neanderthals from France and Croatia, early Homo sapiens from Ethiopia and Israel. Arranged chronologically, they tell a story of gradual transformation, of one species flowing into another across hundreds of thousands of years. Except the flow stops. Around 200,000 years ago, the rate of morphological change in the human lineage dramatically decreases. Earlier hominin evolution shows rapid shifts in skull shape, brain size, dental structure. But after the emergence of Homo sapiens, those changes slow to a crawl. We look essentially the same today as people did 100,000 years ago. Same skeletal proportions, same cranial capacity, same dental arcade. Evolution didn't stop. We still show minor adaptations in things like skin color, lactose tolerance, high-altitude physiology, but the fundamental human body plan stabilized. Paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould called this phenomenon punctuated equilibrium. The observation that species tend to remain morphologically stable for long periods punctuated by brief bursts of rapid change. The pattern appears throughout the fossil record. Species emerge, persist largely unchanged for millions of years, then either go extinct or rapidly transform into something new. The mechanisms driving punctuated equilibrium remain debated, but the pattern itself is undeniable. Humans show this pattern in extreme form. The transition from archaic to modern humans happened relatively quickly in evolutionary terms, perhaps over 100,000 years. But once modern human anatomy was established, it stopped changing. The genetic bottleneck at 200,000 years ago coincides almost exactly with this morphological stabilization, which suggests they're connected, that whatever caused the genetic collapse also locked our physical form into place. One explanation involves what geneticists call stabilizing selection. Most mutations are either neutral or slightly harmful. Beneficial mutations are rare. In a large, genetically diverse population, natural selection can act efficiently, favoring beneficial variants and eliminating harmful ones. But in a small population that's gone through a severe bottleneck, selection becomes less efficient. Random genetic drift overpowers selection for all but the most strongly harmful or beneficial variants. Many slightly deleterious mutations can persist simply by chance. This creates a genetic load, a burden of suboptimal variants that reduces average fitness. To counteract genetic load, populations evolve mechanisms to buffer against harmful mutations. One such mechanism is genetic canalization, where developmental systems become more robust, less sensitive to genetic variation. Traits become standardized. Variation decreases. The population maintains a stable phenotype despite underlying genetic diversity because development itself has evolved to be conservative. Dr. Adam Wilkins, an evolutionary biologist who has written extensively on domestication and human evolution, suggests that modern humans show signs of self-domestication. The suite of traits we associate with domesticated animals, reduced aggression, increased social tolerance, retention of juvenile characteristics into adulthood, neoteny, all appear in modern humans compared to archaic human species. Domestication typically involves selection for tameness, the ability to live in close proximity to others without excessive aggression. This selection inadvertently affects other traits because the genes controlling social behavior also influence facial structure, pigmentation, hormone levels, and brain development. If early modern humans underwent selection for increased social tolerance, perhaps because group cooperation became essential for survival, this could explain both the genetic bottleneck and the morphological stabilization. Small, highly cooperative groups would be more efficient than larger, less cohesive ones. They could maintain complex cultural knowledge, coordinate hunting and defense, care for young and injured members. But being highly selective about group membership would restrict gene flow between groups. Over time, this would reduce genetic diversity even as it increased behavioral sophistication. The trade-off would be profound. Greater cooperation within groups, better cultural transmission, more efficient learning, but at the cost of genetic diversity and morphological flexibility. We locked ourselves into a stable form because that form worked, because changing it would disrupt the intricate developmental and social systems we'd built around it. But the numbers don't work entirely. Stabilizing selection can explain why morphology stopped changing, but it doesn't fully explain why genetic diversity collapsed so severely. For that, we need something more dramatic, something catastrophic. Between 930,000 and 813,000 years ago, long before the bottleneck we've been discussing, human ancestors went through an even more severe population collapse. Research published in Science in 2023 by an international team led by Chinese researchers used coalescent modeling to infer that the breeding population crashed to approximately 1,280 individuals. Not total population, breeding individuals, meaning the actual number of humans alive was perhaps 3 to 5 times higher, somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 people. For 117,000 years, human ancestors persisted at this critically low number. This ancient bottleneck had consequences that rippled forward through time. It created a genetic architecture predisposed to further bottlenecks. Small populations lose genetic diversity rapidly. Once lost, diversity can only be restored through mutation, and we've already established that human mutation rates slowed. So each subsequent bottleneck would compound the effects of previous ones. By the time modern humans emerged 300,000 to 200,000 years ago, our species may have already been genetically impoverished compared to archaic human populations that didn't go through the ancient bottleneck. This layering of bottlenecks, each one stripping away more variation, creates the pattern we see today. Remarkably low genetic diversity. a mutation rate slower than expected, morphological stasis, all the hallmarks of a species that squeezed through multiple evolutionary constrictions and emerged on the other side fundamentally changed. The question remains, why did these bottlenecks happen? Climate change affects all species, but humans are the only ones showing this pattern. Disease couldn't have been species-specific at that point in our evolution. Geography can't explain it. We were spread across Africa and parts of Eurasia, which leaves behavioral explanations, social structure, mating systems, cultural practices that restricted gene flow or made populations vulnerable to collapse. We created the conditions for our own near-extinction, not intentionally, not consciously, but through the aggregate effects of thousands of individual choices about who to cooperate with, who to fight, who to mate with, who to share resources with. We built cultures, and cultures built constraints, and those constraints nearly destroyed us. But they also made us human. Imagine standing on the shore of Lake Malawi in East Africa at sunset 190,000 years ago. The water stretches to the horizon, deep and still, reflecting clouds edged with orange light. Behind you, scattered across the landscape, maybe 300 people constitute your entire world. 300 individuals who make up one of perhaps 30 or 40 such groups scattered across the African continent. The total human population wouldn't fill a modern football stadium. Everyone alive could know everyone else through 2 or 3 degrees of separation. In this world, genetic diversity isn't an abstract concept. It's visible in the faces around evening fires. It's the handful of family lineages that constitute your entire species. This was the world that existed during the bottleneck. Not a world of vast prehistoric wildernesses teeming with humans, but a world where we were rare, peripheral, barely holding on while other species thrived around us. Baboons numbered in the millions. Elephants ranged across the continent in vast herds. Even other human species, Homo heidelbergensis populations in Europe and Asia, likely outnumbered Homo sapiens in Africa. We weren't special. We were endangered. Dr. Curtis Marian of Arizona State University has spent years excavating caves along the southern coast of South Africa, particularly Pinnacle Point and Blombos Cave. These sites preserve evidence of human occupation during critical periods of environmental stress. Shell middens, stone tools, ochre processing. The people living there were eating marine resources, specialized foods that required knowledge and technology to harvest efficiently. This represents what Marian calls a cognitive breakthrough, the ability to identify, process, and consume foods that other species ignored or couldn't access. But here's what's remarkable about these sites. They're small. The caves couldn't have supported more than a few dozen people at a time. Yet the occupation layers span thousands of years, with distinct cultural traditions maintained across countless generations. These were refugia, places where small groups held on during periods when vast stretches of the African interior became uninhabitable due to drought, cold, or ecological collapse. The coast provided stability, predictable resources, marine foods that didn't disappear during terrestrial climate fluctuations. The genetic signature of these refugial populations appears in modern human DNA. Research published in 2020 analyzing ancient genomes from southern African populations shows that some lineages remained isolated for upward of 100,000 years. These groups evolved in place, maintaining genetic distinctiveness that persists to this day in Khoisan populations. The isolation wasn't complete, there was occasional gene flow, but it was limited enough that separate evolutionary trajectories developed within the same species on the same continent. This fragmentation explains the bottleneck mechanically. Small, isolated populations lose genetic diversity through drift. Occasionally, a population goes extinct entirely, taking its unique genetic variants with it. The survivors carry forward only a fraction of the original species' genetic potential. Over time, the species as a whole becomes less diverse even though individual populations might be thriving locally. What it doesn't explain is why the bottleneck ended when it did. If humans persisted in small fragmented populations for hundreds of thousands of years, why did we suddenly expand? What changed 70,000 to 60,000 years ago that allowed modern humans to explode outward from Africa, colonizing the entire planet in less than 50,000 years? The archaeological record from this period shows something new. Technology becomes more sophisticated. Composite tools appear, multiple materials like stone, wood, bone, and adhesive combined into single implements. This requires planning, multiple-step manufacturing processes, and specialized knowledge. Art becomes common. The famous Blombos cave ochre engravings date to around 70,000 years ago. Abstract geometric patterns deliberately inscribed on smoothed ochre plaques. These aren't accidental marks. They're symbols, messages, communications in visual form. Most significantly, long-distance trade networks appear. Obsidian from sources in Kenya appears in sites in South Africa. Marine shells from the coast appear at inland sites hundreds of kilometers away. These exchanges required sustained contact between groups. Social networks. Relationships that transcended immediate kin groups. The fragmentation was ending. Cultural boundaries were becoming permeable. Dr. Ian Tattersall, paleoanthropologist at the American Museum of Natural History, argues that this period saw the emergence of fully modern human cognition. Not that people before 70,000 years ago weren't intelligent, they clearly were, but that something about how they thought changed. Language became more complex. Abstract reasoning improved. The ability to think symbolically, to use one thing to represent another, became more sophisticated. This cognitive leap enabled the complex social structures and technological innovations that characterized the Upper Paleolithic. But cognition doesn't leave fossils. Brains don't preserve. We infer cognitive change from artifacts, from the complexity of tools and the presence of symbolic objects. It's indirect evidence. Suggestive but not conclusive. The timing might be coincidental. Technology might have advanced for purely practical reasons. Better tools enable better resource extraction, which enables larger populations, which enable more innovation in a positive feedback loop. No cognitive revolution required, unless the cognitive revolution was itself the product of the genetic bottleneck. This is where the story curves back on itself in ways that might keep you awake despite the late hour. What if the genetic homogeneity that resulted from the bottleneck actually enabled more complex culture? Consider what culture requires. Shared understanding, common frames of reference, the ability to communicate complex ideas and have them understood similarly by different individuals. This is easier in genetically similar populations. Not because genes directly encode ideas, but because genes influence brain development, and similar brains process information similarly. Two people with nearly identical genetic backgrounds might find it easier to achieve mutual understanding than two people from genetically divergent populations. Modern humans post-bottleneck were the most genetically homogeneous large mammal species on Earth. We still are. This homogeneity might have reduced barriers to cultural transmission, made it easier to build cumulative culture, where each generation adds to the knowledge base rather than reinventing it. Made it easier to form large cooperative groups where individuals could predict others' behaviors and responses. Made language more efficient because fewer idiosyncratic differences existed between individuals' cognitive architectures. The bottleneck destroyed us genetically, but it created something new. A species unified not by genetic diversity but by genetic similarity. A species that could build complex cultures precisely because we were all working with very similar mental hardware. The diversity we lost in our genes we replaced with diversity in our cultures. We became the only species on Earth that's more variable culturally than genetically. Part 6 Word count. 1,000 words in the quiet hours before dawn. When sleep feels closest, consider the mathematics of survival. A population of 10,000 breeding individuals, scattered across a continent in groups of a few hundred, each group separated by hundreds of kilometers. Each generation, roughly every 25 years, some groups fail. Disease, drought, violence, random demographic fluctuation. A group that happens to produce slightly more males than females for 2 consecutive generations might fail to replace itself and fade into extinction. The genetic variants unique to that group vanish forever. Mathematical models of population dynamics suggest that small populations have a critical threshold below which extinction becomes nearly inevitable. For large mammals like humans, This threshold is somewhere between 500 and 5,000 individuals depending on generation time, genetic diversity, and environmental variability. We hovered at or below this threshold for hundreds of thousands of years. That we survived at all is statistically improbable. Dr. John Hawks, a paleoanthropologist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison who maintains extensive research on human population genetics, has pointed out repeatedly that the genetic evidence for a Toba-induced bottleneck around 74,000 years ago is essentially absent. Despite years of searching, geneticists haven't found a clear signal of population collapse at that time. The bottleneck signatures we detect are older, deeper, more persistent than a single catastrophic event could produce. Which means the near extinction of humanity wasn't an event. It was a condition, a state we existed in for so long that it shaped every aspect of what we became. Living at the edge of extinction creates selection pressures that don't exist for successful, abundant species. Every individual matters. Every death threatens the group. Every reproductive failure carries existential weight. In this environment, behaviors that increase group cohesion and individual survival value become overwhelmingly important. Cooperation isn't just advantageous. It's mandatory. Groups that can't cooperate effectively don't leave descendants. Their genes vanish along with their cultures. This explains something puzzling about modern humans. We are simultaneously the most cooperative and most violent species on Earth. We build global civilizations requiring coordination among millions of strangers. We create aid organizations that send resources to people we'll never meet. We risk our lives for abstract ideals like justice and freedom. But we also wage wars that kill millions. We engage in genocide. We create systems of oppression and exploitation that persist for centuries. These contradictions make sense in light of our evolutionary history. We evolved extreme in-group cooperation as a survival mechanism during the bottleneck. But that same psychology creates sharp in-group/out-group boundaries. We cooperate intensely with those we define as us, and can be ruthlessly competitive or hostile toward those we define as them. The genetic bottleneck created a species psychologically adapted for small group survival under extreme conditions. Then we applied that psychology to building civilizations. The mismatch creates many of the tensions that characterize modern human societies. Our instincts are calibrated for groups of a few hundred. Our societies contain millions or billions. We're still working out how to make that scale transition successfully. But perhaps the most profound consequence of the bottleneck is one we rarely discuss. It made us conscious of mortality in ways other species aren't. Small populations existing at the edge of extinction would have witnessed death constantly. Not as an abstract concept, but as an immediate, persistent reality. Every elder who died represented an irreplaceable repository of knowledge. Every child who didn't survive to adulthood was a potentially catastrophic loss of genetic and cultural potential. Death wasn't natural. It was threatening, existential. This might explain the emergence of symbolic behavior, ritual burial, and what would eventually become religious consciousness. The earliest known intentional burials date to roughly 100,000 years ago. Bodies placed deliberately in graves, sometimes with grave goods, suggesting belief that death wasn't simply the end of existence. These practices appear during the period of genetic bottleneck. During the time when small groups were desperately trying to maintain themselves against overwhelming odds. Anthropologist Brian Hayden has argued that ritual and religious behavior emerge from existential anxiety, the awareness of mortality combined with the inability to control it. In small populations where every individual mattered, where group survival depended on maintaining knowledge and social cohesion, death would have been especially anxiety-provoking. Ritual provides a way to manage that anxiety, to create meaning around loss, to maintain group solidarity in the face of ongoing attrition. We buried our dead because we were so close to joining them. We created rituals because we needed to believe that survival was possible, that the struggle meant something, that we weren't just random chance away from extinction. These practices didn't emerge from abundance and leisure. They emerged from desperation and fear, from being a species that knew, at some perhaps unconscious level, that it was failing. And yet we didn't fail. Somehow, despite genetic diversity lower than any other great ape, Despite mutation rates that had slowed, despite population numbers that should have guaranteed extinction, we survived. Not just survived, thrived. Expanded to become the most successful large mammal on the planet. Which means the bottleneck didn't just change us. It revealed something about human potential that wasn't obvious before. The scale breaks our models in another way too. Geneticists estimate that over 99% of all species that have ever existed are now extinct. Extinction is the normal fate of species. It's what happens when environments change faster than populations can adapt. Given our low genetic diversity and small population sizes, we should have been extraordinarily vulnerable to extinction. Any environmental change, any disease, any ecological disruption should have been able to wipe us out. But we developed a cheat code: culture, the ability to adapt behaviorally without waiting for genetic change. When climate shifted, we didn't need to evolve different physiology. We invented clothing and shelter. When prey species declined, we didn't need to evolve different digestive systems. We invented new hunting techniques and expanded our diet. When populations became isolated, we didn't need to evolve new mating signals. We maintained contact through trade and kinship networks. Culture decoupled adaptation from genetics. This was the evolutionary innovation that saved us during the bottleneck. Not bigger brains, we'd already had those for hundreds of thousands of years. Not better tools, archaic humans made sophisticated tools too. But the capacity for cumulative culture. Each generation building on the previous one. Knowledge accumulating across time in the collective memory of groups rather than in individual brains. Picture 3 scientists working late in a laboratory at the Broad Institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The year is 2013. They're hunched over computer screens displaying endless strings of genetic code, looking for patterns that might reveal when specific human lineages diverged. This is coalescent analysis, a mathematical technique that works backward from present-day genetic diversity to infer the structure of ancestral populations. The computer churns through millions of simulations, testing different population models against observed genetic data, rejecting scenarios that don't match, refining estimates of when and how populations split. Their results, when published later that year, would challenge decades of established thinking. Mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosomal Adam, the most recent common ancestors of all maternal and paternal lineages, lived much closer. Together in time than previously thought. Not separated by 50,000 or 100,000 years, but perhaps only 20,000 to 40,000 years apart. In population genetic terms, that's essentially simultaneous. It means both maternal and paternal lineages coalesced during the same bottleneck event. Same crisis. Same near-extinction. Both halves of human heredity squeezed through the same evolutionary needle's eye. This matters because it rules out certain types of population structures. If mitochondrial and Y-chromosome lineages coalesced at very different times, it would suggest complex demographics. Perhaps multiple waves of population expansion and contraction. Perhaps sex-biased migration where males and females moved in different patterns. But synchronous coalescence suggests a simple, devastating population crash that affected both sexes equally. The entire species, not just one sex or one region, went through the bottleneck together. But here's where it gets stranger. While global human populations show this severe bottleneck, some regional populations show evidence of greater ancient diversity that subsequently disappeared. Ancient DNA extracted from a 40,000-year-old individual from Tianyuan Cave in China shows mitochondrial lineages that don't exist in modern East Asian populations. Ancient Europeans from Paleolithic sites carry Y-chromosome lineages that vanished before the Neolithic period. These weren't rare variants. They were common enough to appear in the small sample of ancient individuals we've managed to sequence. This implies extinction events after modern humans had already expanded out of Africa. The bottleneck at 200,000 years ago wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a pattern. Human populations expanded, accumulated some new diversity through mutation and possibly admixture with other human species, then contracted again. Multiple times. Each contraction erasing some of the accumulated variation. Each expansion rebuilding populations from an even smaller genetic base than before. Dr. Rasmus Nielsen, a computational biologist at UC Berkeley, has published extensively on these patterns. His research shows that modern human populations outside Africa went through at least one severe bottleneck after leaving Africa, possibly associated with the Toba eruption or subsequent climate fluctuations during the early Upper Paleolithic. European populations went through another bottleneck at the end of the Ice Age, around 12,000 years ago. East Asian populations show evidence of bottlenecks associated with various climate events. Each bottleneck further reduced genetic diversity. We're living in the aftermath of multiple near-extinctions. Our genomes are palimpsests, layer upon layer of demographic history written, erased, and overwritten. The 200,000-year-old bottleneck is just the deepest, oldest, most severe of these layers. But it established a pattern that repeated throughout our history. Humans expanded into new environments, thrived temporarily, then crashed when conditions changed. Our genetic diversity didn't gradually accumulate through mutation as theory predicts. It was repeatedly destroyed through bottlenecks and rebuilt from small founder populations. This creates a paradox. We're supposedly the most adaptable species on Earth. We colonized every terrestrial biome. We survived climate changes that drove countless other species extinct. Yet our genetics show a species repeatedly driven to the brink of extinction. How do we reconcile human success with genetic evidence of repeated failure? The answer returns to culture. Each time human populations crashed, they survived because cultural knowledge preserved essential adaptations even when genetic diversity was lost. The group that survived the bottleneck didn't need genetic variants for cold tolerance because they had knowledge of fire and clothing. They didn't need genetic variants for water stress because they had knowledge of water sources and storage techniques. Cultural information became more important than genetic information for survival. This inverts the usual narrative of evolution. We think of genetics as primary and culture as secondary, an addition that appeared recently in human history. But for modern humans, culture may have become the primary adaptation and genetics secondary. We preserved just enough genetic diversity to maintain basic biological function, but most of our adaptive capacity shifted to the cultural realm. We became a species that evolves primarily culturally rather than genetically. This matters because it suggests our genetic homogeneity isn't a weakness. It's a feature. The bottleneck removed genetic diversity that was no longer necessary because culture had replaced it. We didn't need genetic variants for every possible environment because we had cultural variants. Technology, knowledge, social organization. These could be modified and transmitted far faster than genes could evolve. The bottleneck stripped away genetic redundancy and left us streamlined, simplified, optimized for cultural rather than genetic evolution. But there's a cost. Genetic diversity provides insurance against the unknown. If a new disease emerges, a genetically diverse population likely contains some individuals with resistance. If climate changes unpredictably, a diverse population likely contains variants that function better in the new conditions. We sacrificed that insurance. We put all our adaptive eggs in the cultural basket, which works brilliantly as long as culture remains intact, but becomes catastrophically risky if culture is disrupted. This vulnerability appeared throughout human history. When the Roman Empire collapsed, much accumulated knowledge was lost. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE saw writing systems disappear and technological complexity decline. The Black Death in medieval Europe killed such a large percentage of the population that many specialized crafts and technologies were lost. Each of these events represented a partial cultural bottleneck, erasing knowledge that had accumulated over centuries. We're dependent on culture in ways no other species is. Other species can lose individual populations, but the species continues because genetic information is distributed across all populations. But if humans lost accumulated cultural knowledge, if we suffered a catastrophic disruption that prevented transmission of technology and social organization to the next generation, we'd be in serious trouble. Our genetics alone wouldn't be sufficient to rebuild complex society. We'd be a species of apex predators suddenly reduced to subsistence-level survival. The genetic bottleneck 200,000 years ago made us human, but it also made us fragile in new ways. In the darkest hours of night, when consciousness drifts between waking and sleep, imagine the first person who realized they were mortal. not instinctively afraid of death in the way all animals are, but consciously aware that existence ends, that the self, the accumulated memories and relationships and knowledge that constitute personhood, would one day cease. This awareness, this uniquely human burden, might have emerged during the bottleneck period, when death was so common, so immediate, that it became impossible to ignore. Archaeological evidence suggests that by 100,000 years ago, humans were burying their dead with deliberation. Graves at Kafsa Cave in Israel contain individuals interred with ochre and shells, materials that required effort to obtain and had symbolic rather than functional value. The act of burial, of removing the dead from view and marking their location, suggests conceptual frameworks for understanding death as a transition rather than simply an ending. These practices appear during the period when genetic evidence indicates human populations were at their smallest and most fragile. There's a connection here that philosophers and anthropologists have long debated. Does awareness of mortality drive cultural complexity? Do we create art, ritual, technology, civilization itself as elaborate coping mechanisms for the unbearable knowledge that we die? The timing suggests possibly yes. The archaeological signatures of fully modern human behavior, symbolic art, ritual burial, long-distance trade, sophisticated technology, all appear during or immediately after the genetic bottleneck. During the period when death would have been most visible, most threatening to small populations desperately trying to persist. Dr. Ian Tattersall has argued that modern human consciousness represents a qualitative break from earlier forms of cognition, what he calls symbolic intelligence. This isn't just being smart. Neanderthals were smart. Homo erectus was smart. But modern humans think symbolically. We use one thing to represent another. We construct mental models of reality that we can manipulate independently of immediate sensory experience. We plan for hypothetical futures and learn from reconstructed pasts. This type of thinking enables science, art, religion, and all forms of complex culture. What Tattersall doesn't emphasize as much is when this capacity emerged and under what circumstances. The bottleneck provides context. Small populations facing extinction need to maximize every survival advantage. Intelligence becomes paramount. The smartest individuals, the best problem solvers, the most creative thinkers, would have disproportionate influence on group survival. In a large, thriving population, individual genius matters less. The species muddles through. But in a population of a few thousand people, a single brilliant innovation, better tool technology, more efficient hunting strategy, new food source, could mean the difference between extinction and survival. The bottleneck wasn't just selecting for intelligence generally. It was selecting for the specific type of intelligence that enables cumulative culture. Social learning, teaching, the ability to observe what others do and reproduce it accurately. Language capability to communicate complex procedures. Memory capacity to retain techniques across decades. All of these traits would have been under intense selection pressure in small groups trying to maintain cultural knowledge across generations. This creates a feedback loop. Bottleneck reduces population. Small population needs culture to survive. Culture requires cognitive abilities. Selection favors those cognitive abilities. Enhanced cognition enables more complex culture. More complex culture supports larger populations. But larger populations fragment culturally. Cultural fragmentation creates genetic boundaries. Genetic boundaries reduce gene flow. Reduced gene flow leads to bottlenecks. The cycle repeats. We're products of this cycle. Our genetics show it. Our archaeology shows it. Our psychology shows it. We're a species that evolved to survive in small groups under extreme pressure, then applied those evolved traits to building civilizations containing billions of people. The mismatch explains many puzzling aspects of modern human behavior. Why we form tight in-groups and exclude out-groups. Why we're capable of both remarkable cooperation and horrifying violence. Why we build elaborate symbolic systems, religions, ideologies, national identities, to define who belongs and who doesn't. These traits aren't accidental. They're adaptations forged during the bottleneck period when group membership was literally a matter of life and death. When knowing who to trust and who to exclude could determine whether your group survived the next decade. Those who were good at maintaining group boundaries, at enforcing cooperation within the group while defending against outside threats, left more descendants. We carry their psychology. But here's the question that might keep you awake. Are we still in the bottleneck? Genetically, we never recovered. Human genetic diversity today is essentially what it was 50,000 years ago. We expanded from a few thousand individuals to nearly 8 billion, but we did it so quickly in evolutionary terms that mutation hasn't had time to restore lost diversity. The genetic shadow of the bottleneck still covers our species. We're a successful endangered species. Billions of individuals, planet-spanning technological civilization, ecological dominance unprecedented in Earth's history. But genetically we're still hovering near that extinction threshold. Still carrying the reduced diversity, the slowed mutation rate, the genetic load accumulated during hundreds of thousands of years at critically low population numbers. Still vulnerable in ways more genetically diverse species aren't. Modern genetics is revealing this vulnerability. Studies of disease susceptibility show that genetic uniformity makes human populations vulnerable to pandemic diseases. The same receptors for viral entry appear in nearly all humans. The same metabolic pathways show similar weaknesses. If a pathogen evolves to exploit these common vulnerabilities, it can spread through the entire species. More genetically diverse species have subpopulations with different susceptibilities. Some individuals are immune. The species survives even if particular populations are devastated. Humans lack this protection. We've compensated with technology, medical science, public health infrastructure. These cultural adaptations provide the diversity our genetics lack. We can respond to novel diseases not with genetic variation but with vaccines, treatments, behavioral modifications. This works. It's how we've survived pandemics from smallpox to influenza to COVID-19. But it requires maintaining cultural complexity. Requires functional societies with the resources and organization to mount medical responses. Which brings us back to fragility. Our survival depends on maintaining complex culture. If that culture is disrupted, if technological civilization suffers severe damage, we'd be a species of 8 billion individuals with genetic diversity equivalent to a few thousand. We'd face any environmental challenges, climate change, disease, resource scarcity, with limited adaptive capacity. Our genetics wouldn't save us. Only culture can. Only maintaining and transmitting knowledge can. We're permanently dependent on being cultural beings. The bottleneck made that irreversible. Somewhere in a climate-controlled vault in Atlanta, Georgia, at the Centers for Disease Control headquarters, frozen samples of human DNA from populations around the world rest in liquid nitrogen. These samples, collected over decades from indigenous populations, African tribes, Asian communities, Pacific Islanders, Native American groups, represent the breadth of human genetic diversity. Researchers study these samples to understand disease susceptibility, to trace migration patterns, to reconstruct population history. But what's most remarkable about these samples isn't what they show. It's what they don't show. They don't show significant genetic differences between populations. The variation that exists is minor, superficial. Skin color, facial features, hair texture, these are controlled by tiny fractions of the genome. The rest, the vast majority of our genetic material, is essentially identical across all human populations. A Hadza hunter from Tanzania and an Inuit fisherman from Alaska share over 99.9% of their DNA sequence. They're more closely related genetically than two chimpanzees from different troops in the same forest. This similarity has profound implications. It means human races, as biologically distinct categories, don't exist. The genetic variation that does exist is distributed continuously across geography, not clustered into discrete groups. It means we're one species in a much deeper sense than most people realize. Not just capable of interbreeding, which is the usual biological definition of species, but carrying essentially identical genetic blueprints. The differences we perceive as fundamental are actually superficial evolutionary noise. This bothers some people. We're psychologically adapted to categorize things, to draw boundaries, to divide the world into us and them. The genetic evidence doesn't support those divisions. It shows instead a species that diversified slightly after leaving Africa, adapting to local conditions through minor genetic tweaks, but remaining fundamentally uniform. The bottleneck homogenized us. The subsequent expansions didn't create meaningful new diversity. We're a monoculture masquerading as diversity. But cultural diversity is real. Dramatically, magnificently real. The same genetic blueprint produces Tibetan Buddhism and Amazonian shamanism, Japanese tea ceremony and Polynesian navigation, Inuit oral histories and Aboriginal dreamtime stories. Same genes. Radically different cultures. This proves that culture isn't simply an expression of genetics. It's an independent evolutionary system with its own dynamics, its own inheritance mechanisms, its own trajectory. The anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss spent his career documenting the structural similarities underlying seemingly different cultures. He found that despite surface differences, human cultures share deep patterns, common myths, common social structures, common symbolic systems. He attributed this to universal features of human cognition, the idea that all human brains work similarly and therefore produce similar cultural forms. He was more right than he knew. The genetic bottleneck created cognitive uniformity. Not identity but high similarity. Our brains are templates stamped from nearly the same mold. The cultural diversity we've generated emerged from tiny variations amplified through historical contingency. This explains something puzzling about human history. Cultural innovations spread rapidly across unconnected populations. Agriculture was independently invented at least 7 times in different regions. Pottery, metalworking, writing, monumental architecture. These technologies appeared in geographically separated populations with no contact. Standard explanation attributes this to similar environmental conditions driving similar innovations. But maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe nearly identical brains facing similar problems generate similar solutions. Cultural evolution is constrained by cognitive architecture. We can only invent things our brains are capable of imagining. Since all human brains are nearly identical, constrained by the same genetic blueprint hammered into shape during the bottleneck, we end up reinventing the same cultural forms independently. This has implications for the future. If human cognition is constrained by our genetic uniformity, there may be limits to the types of cultures and technologies we can develop. Not because we lack intelligence, but because intelligence itself is channeled along particular pathways determined by brain structure. We might be forever blind to possibilities that would be obvious to beings with different cognitive architectures. We've built a technological civilization based on mathematics, logic, empirical observation. These tools work brilliantly, but they reflect how human brains process information. A species with different neurology might develop entirely different intellectual frameworks we can't even conceive of. This isn't science fiction speculation. It's a logical consequence of the bottleneck. By reducing genetic diversity, we reduced cognitive diversity. By standardizing brain structure, we standardize thought itself. The collective intelligence of humanity is powerful but fundamentally limited by running on billions of copies of nearly the same hardware. We can't escape our neurology. We can only work within its constraints. Maybe this is why certain problems seem intractable. Not because they're objectively impossible to solve, but because the solutions require cognitive approaches our brains aren't wired for. Understanding quantum mechanics, grasping deep time, cooperating at scales beyond a few hundred individuals. These challenges sit at the edge of human cognitive capability. We can barely manage them, and only through elaborate cultural scaffolding that compensates for our neurological limitations. The bottleneck gave us consciousness, language, symbolic thought, and cumulative culture. But it also trapped us within a particular form of consciousness, a particular type of language, a specific mode of symbolic thought. We're tremendously capable within that mode. We've built civilizations, decoded the genome, sent probes beyond the solar system. But we're operating within constraints we can't perceive because they're built into how we perceive. Other human species might have had different cognitive architectures. Neanderthals had brains as large as ours but shaped differently. Elongated. Their visual cortex was larger. Their frontal lobes configured differently. Would Neanderthal consciousness have felt different from ours? Would they have thought thoughts we can't think? We'll never know. They're extinct. Modern humans are the only human species remaining. The only cognitive architecture left is ours. Whatever alternatives existed vanished with the species that carried them. The bottleneck didn't just reduce genetic diversity. It reduced cognitive diversity. It narrowed the space of possible human experiences to a single mode of being. We're 8 billion iterations of essentially the same mind. This creates remarkable similarity in human experience. A poem written in ancient Sumeria can still move a modern reader. An ancestor from 50,000 years ago, if raised in modern society, would be recognizably human in psychology and behavior. We share subjective experience across vast stretches of time and space because we share neurology. But it means we're alone. Not just alone as a species on our planet, which is obvious, but alone as a type of mind. There are no other human consciousnesses to compare ours against. No alternative perspectives within our own species. Just variations on a single theme repeated billions of times. In the pre-dawn darkness, think about time. Not clock time. Not calendar time, but evolutionary time, the deep time that measures change across generations. For bacteria, evolutionary time runs quickly. Generations span hours. Mutations accumulate rapidly. A bacterial population can evolve meaningful adaptations in days or weeks. For humans, evolutionary time crawls. Generations span decades. Mutations accumulate slowly, even more slowly after the rate deceleration we discussed. Meaningful evolutionary change requires thousands of generations, tens of thousands of years. This means modern humans are essentially unchanged since the bottleneck. The 10,000 generations since we emerged as a distinct species isn't enough time for significant evolutionary modification, especially given our reduced mutation rate and small historical population sizes. The humans who painted Lascaux Cave 17,000 years ago were genetically nearly identical to us. The humans who built Göbekli Tepe 11,000 years ago could walk through a modern city and apart from appearance and dress would be indistinguishable from contemporary humans. Same brain structure, same cognitive capacity, same emotional range, same psychological drives. But their world was utterly different. No writing, no mathematics, no formal logic, no accumulated scientific knowledge, no history extending beyond oral tradition. They were us, trapped in a different cultural configuration. This demonstrates how little genetics determines about human experience. Everything we consider essential to modern human life, literacy, technology, complex institutions, scientific worldview, emerged culturally in the last 10,000 years. Our genetics barely changed. Our culture transformed completely. We're Stone Age minds navigating a digital world. This mismatch creates tensions that pervade modern life. We evolved for small groups but live in cities of millions. We evolved for immediate physical threats but face abstract long-term risks like climate change. We evolved for direct social relationships but interact through screens and digital avatars. We're constantly adapting culturally to circumstances our biology never prepared us for. Usually this works. Human behavioral flexibility is enormous. We can adjust to almost any cultural configuration. Hunter-gatherer bands, agricultural villages, industrial cities, spacefaring civilizations, same genetics, radically different ways of life. This flexibility is itself an adaptation forged during the bottleneck. Groups that could adjust quickly to changing conditions survived. Groups that couldn't went extinct. We're descended from the adaptable ones. But flexibility has limits. Psychological disorders might represent the points where those limits are exceeded. Anxiety, depression, ADHD. These conditions are epidemic in modern industrial societies, but were likely much rarer in ancestral environments. Maybe they're manifestations of Stone Age psychology breaking under modern conditions. Anxiety evolved to help us respond to immediate physical threats. In modern life, it fixates on abstract future possibilities we can't fight or flee from. Depression might represent a mismatch between evolved expectations, close social bonds, meaningful work, clear purpose, and modern reality, social isolation, abstract labor, existential confusion. If this is correct, it means many modern psychological problems aren't primarily biological. They're cultural. They emerge from trying to force Stone Age minds into modern configurations those minds weren't designed for. The solution isn't necessarily medication, though that can help, but cultural change. Redesigning our environments and social structures to better match our evolved psychology. This is already happening in small ways. Urban planning increasingly emphasizes walkability, green space, and human-scale architecture because these align with evolved preferences. Workplace reforms focus on autonomy and meaningful work rather than just compensation. Educational approaches emphasize collaborative learning and hands-on experience rather than pure abstraction. These changes don't modify genetics. They modify culture to better fit unchanged genetic predispositions. But there's a limit to how much we can or should adjust culture to match evolutionary psychology. Modern civilization requires behaviors that don't come naturally. Delayed gratification, abstract reasoning, cooperation with strangers, subordination to impersonal rules and institutions. These are culturally constructed, maintained through education and socialization, not genetic instinct. If we tailored culture entirely to Stone Age psychology, we'd lose most of what makes modern civilization function. We're stuck navigating this tension. Evolved psychology pulling in one direction, cultural requirements pulling in another. Most people manage. We're remarkably good at cultural adaptation. But the tension never fully resolves. It manifests in the background unease that characterizes modern life. The sense that something isn't quite right, that we're living in ways that don't feel entirely natural, that we're adapting to demands we weren't built for. The genetic bottleneck created this situation. By locking human biology into place 200,000 years ago, it ensured that all subsequent human experience would be lived in bodies and brains designed for a vanished world. We can't evolve our way out. The timescale for genetic change is too long. By the time natural selection could modify human psychology to better fit modern conditions, those conditions will have changed again. Culture evolves in decades or centuries. Genetics evolves in tens of thousands of years. There's no catching up. This means the future of humanity isn't primarily biological. It's cultural and technological. We'll continue adapting through culture, creating new social forms, new technologies, new ways of being human. Our genetics will remain essentially static. We might modify them deliberately through genetic engineering, but that's technology applied to biology, not natural evolution. Nature stopped shaping humans 200,000 years ago. Now we shape ourselves. This is both liberation and burden. Liberation because we're no longer constrained by evolutionary processes. We can change rapidly, experimentally, deliberately. Burden because every change is our responsibility. We can't blame nature if things go wrong. We can't appeal to evolutionary imperatives to justify social structures. Everything is choice. Everything is contingent. Everything could be otherwise. The genetic bottleneck marked the moment when humans stopped being primarily biological beings and became primarily cultural beings. When our evolution shifted from genetic to cultural. When our future became something we create rather than something that happens to us. We didn't know this was happening. The people living through the bottleneck had no concept of genetics or evolution. They were just trying to survive. But their survival reshaped what it meant to be human. We're living in the consequences of that reshaping. 8 billion people sharing nearly identical genomes but vastly different cultures. A species that's biologically one but culturally many. A species that evolved to change through genes but now changes through ideas. The bottleneck made this transition inevitable. By destroying genetic diversity, it forced us to invest everything in cultural diversity. We became the symbolic species, the culture bearers, the only species whose primary adaptation is learning. As the night deepens and this story wins toward its conclusion, return to that laboratory in Leipzig. The Max Planck Institute where ancient DNA whispers its secrets through mass spectrometers and gene sequencers. In the data streaming across screens, in the statistical models that reconstruct ancient populations, a pattern emerges that geneticists still struggle to fully explain. Human mitochondrial DNA, That maternal lineage passed unbroken from mother to child for 200,000 years, shows something peculiar in its structure. The phylogenetic tree, the branching diagram that shows how different lineages relate to each other, is oddly top-heavy. Most variation exists in African populations, particularly in southern and eastern Africa. Non-African populations show much less variation, and what variation they do show branches off from a subset of African diversity. This is the signal of the out-of-Africa expansion 70,000 to 60,000 years ago. A small founder population left Africa and colonized the world. But even African diversity is limited. The deepest branches of the tree only go back 200,000 years. Before that, nothing. Or more precisely, a single lineage from which everything else descended. Standard population genetic theory says this could happen through a severe bottleneck. Small population size for an extended period would cause most lineages to go extinct through random drift, leaving only one or a few ancestral lines. But the bottleneck required to create the pattern we observe would have been extreme. Not thousands of individuals. Hundreds, perhaps fewer. The math is uncomfortable. It suggests human population sizes dropped to levels where extinction should have been virtually certain. Yet we survived. Not just barely. We thrived. Within 100,000 years of the bottleneck, modern humans had spread across Africa. Within 150,000 years, we'd reached the Middle East. Within 200,000 years, we'd colonized Europe, Asia, Australia, and eventually the Americas. We went from the edge of extinction to planetary dominance in an evolutionary eye blink. This recovery suggests something changed. Some adaptation emerged that transformed humans from an endangered species into an unstoppable force. The archaeological record hints at what changed. Technology became more sophisticated. Composite tools appear, hafting stone points to wooden shafts using adhesive. This requires multi-step manufacturing, planning, raw material selection, processing adhesive from tree resins, shaping stone with precision, shaping wood, assembly. Each step requires knowledge and skill. These technologies couldn't be invented by individuals. They required cumulative cultural transmission across generations. Dr. Joseph Henrich of Harvard University has written extensively about what he calls cumulative cultural evolution, the process by which humans build on previous innovations to create increasingly complex technologies and social systems. His research shows that this process requires specific conditions: large enough populations to maintain specialists, social learning mechanisms to transmit skills, norms that reward teaching and cooperation. These conditions didn't exist for most of human evolutionary history, but they emerged sometime around or shortly after the bottleneck period. Maybe the bottleneck created these conditions. When populations are small and survival uncertain, every individual's contribution matters. There's pressure to maximize efficiency, to share knowledge, to cooperate intensely. Cultural innovations that improve group survival spread rapidly because groups without them go extinct. This creates selection pressure not just on individuals but on cultural systems themselves. Groups with better cultural transmission mechanisms outcompete groups with poorer transmission. Over time, this cultural evolution becomes self-reinforcing. Better transmission enables more complex culture. More complex culture provides greater adaptive advantages. Greater advantages allow populations to grow. Larger populations can support more specialists and maintain more cultural complexity. Complexity enables further growth. The bottleneck forced this process to begin. The recovery demonstrated its effectiveness. We've been riding this feedback loop ever since. From stone tools to bronze to iron to steel to silicon. Each transition building on previous knowledge. Each generation inheriting more cultural information than the previous one. This is unique to humans. No other species shows this pattern. Other species have culture. Chimpanzees use tools. Dolphins have social traditions. Whales have songs. But only humans show cumulative culture that builds complexity across hundreds of generations. The genetic bottleneck made this possible by removing genetic variation that would have created cognitive differences between populations. When everyone's brain works similarly, cultural transmission is more efficient. Ideas that make sense to one person make sense to others. Teaching becomes possible because teacher and student share cognitive architecture. This uniformity, forced on us by the bottleneck, became the foundation for cumulative culture. But it raises an unsettling question. If cumulative culture requires genetic uniformity, what happens if that uniformity breaks down? Modern genetic engineering could potentially create cognitive diversity. People with modified neural architecture, enhanced memory, altered perception, different emotional responses. This might be beneficial for individuals, but it could fragment the shared cognitive space that makes culture possible. If people start thinking in fundamentally different ways, communication becomes harder. Shared understanding decreases. Cultural transmission breaks down. This is speculative. We don't know what cognitive diversity would do to cultural transmission. Maybe nothing. Maybe human culture is robust enough to accommodate neurological variation. But the genetic evidence suggests uniformity has been crucial to our success. The bottleneck didn't just happen to preserve uniform cognition. It created the uniformity that enabled everything that came after. This brings us to a final implication. The genetic bottleneck 200,000 years ago might represent something unique in evolutionary history. A species deliberately, though unconsciously, sacrificing genetic diversity to maximize cultural potential. We stripped away biological variation to make room for cultural variation. We simplified our hardware to run more sophisticated software. No other species has done this. No other species needed to. Only humans faced conditions desperate enough that this trade-off made sense. We don't know if it was deliberate. Almost certainly it wasn't. The people living through the bottleneck didn't understand genetics or evolution. They weren't making conscious choices about their species' trajectory. They were just surviving, using whatever strategies worked. But the collective effect of thousands of individual choices over thousands of generations was to reshape the genetic architecture of the species in ways that prioritized cultural over biological adaptation. This was the transition that made us human. Not upright walking, not tool use, not even big brains. These features appeared hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans. What made us human was the genetic bottleneck that forced us to become cultural beings. That made culture our primary adaptation, our defining characteristic, our evolutionary strategy. We became the species that survives through learning rather than through genes. The mutation didn't stop 200,000 years ago. Mutations continued. They continue today, but their importance diminished. They became evolutionary noise rather than evolutionary signal. The real evolution, the changes that matter, shifted to the cultural realm. Somewhere in East Africa, in sediments that haven't yet been discovered, bones rest that tell the story. Not through what they say, but through what they don't say. The absence of fossils from the bottleneck period isn't just poor preservation. The signal. When populations are tiny, scattered across vast territories, the probability of preservation drops to nearly zero. These ghosts haunt our family tree. The thousands of people who lived and died during the crisis period but left no trace. No bones. No graves. No artifacts distinctive enough to be recognized as coming from the critical transition. We know they existed because we exist. Every person alive today traces ancestry through that bottleneck. Your mitochondrial DNA came from a woman who lived during that period. Your Y chromosome, if you're male, came from a man who survived. All your other chromosomes, the autosomes, recombine genetic material from both parents, but even these ultimately trace back to the small population that persisted through the crisis. We're all descendants of survivors, all carriers of the genetic signature they left. This shapes how we think about the bottleneck. It's not ancient history, it's family history. The people who endured weren't abstract evolutionary agents. They were great-great-grandparents repeated 10,000 times. They looked like us, thought like us, felt hope and fear and love the same way we do because we inherited their neurology. They were us just earlier, just facing different circumstances, just trying to survive long enough to have children who might survive to have children. We succeeded because they succeeded, but it was desperately close. If conditions had been slightly worse, if climate had deteriorated a bit more, If population numbers had dropped just a little lower, we wouldn't be here. The bottleneck was narrow enough that chance played a huge role. The right people had to survive. The right knowledge had to be preserved. The right innovations had to occur at the right times. Any of 1,000 random events could have shifted the outcome from survival to extinction. This near miss reverberates through how we should think about human existence. We're not inevitable, not the culmination of evolutionary progress, not destined by natural law to arise and dominate the planet. We're a contingent species that barely survived its own emergence. The fact that we're here to contemplate our origins is itself remarkable. Unlikely, almost miraculous from a probability standpoint, though miracles don't enter into it. Just chance. Just small populations hanging on in isolated refugia while the genetic dice rolled. The other human species weren't as fortunate. Neanderthals, who split from our lineage roughly 600,000 years ago, persisted for hundreds of thousands of years before going extinct around 40,000 years ago. They showed similar signs of low genetic diversity and bottleneck events in their history. Denisovans, known primarily from fragmentary remains in Siberia, also showed limited genetic diversity despite occupying vast geographic ranges. Even Homo erectus, one of the most successful human species, lasting nearly 2 million years and spreading from Africa to Eastern Asia, eventually went extinct. Being human in the broad sense doesn't guarantee survival. Most human species failed. Only we remain. This raises uncomfortable questions about what we did. Modern humans didn't just outlive other human species. We replaced them. We moved into their territories, interbred with them to some degree, then they disappeared. Was this competition? Did our more efficient technologies and social systems simply outcompete them for resources? Was it disease? Did we carry pathogens they had no immunity to? Was it violence? Did we actively eliminate competitors? Or was it something subtler, demographic and cultural advantages that slowly but inevitably displaced other human populations? We don't know. The archaeological record doesn't preserve motivation. We see only outcomes. Neanderthals vanishing from their European refugia within a few thousand years of modern human arrival. Denisovans fading from Asia. Homo floresiensis, the hobbits of Indonesia, disappearing after anatomically modern humans reached their island. Each extinction creates an absence where another form of human consciousness existed. Another way of experiencing the world. Another type of intelligence. Gone. Leaving only modern humans with our specific cognitive architecture, our cultural emphasis, our genetic uniformity. We're alone not by accident but because our specific adaptations proved overwhelmingly effective at displacing alternatives. The genetic bottleneck wasn't a weakness. It was the crucible that forged those adaptations. It forced the shift from genetic to cultural evolution that gave us decisive advantages over other human species. They were smarter than us in many ways. Neanderthals had larger brains, but we had better culture, better social networks, better information transmission. Those cultural advantages, enabled by genetic uniformity, mattered more than individual intelligence. So the bottleneck didn't just shape modern humans. It explained why we're the only humans, why no other variants persist. The same adaptation that saved us during the crisis made us unbeatable afterward. Other human species didn't have the same cultural capabilities because they hadn't been forced through the same genetic crucible. They maintained higher genetic diversity but lower cultural efficiency. In the long run, that was fatal. This creates a narrative that feels almost mythological. The trial by fire. The near-death experience that transforms the survivor. The crisis that reveals hidden strengths. Except this isn't myth. It's written in DNA, coded in patterns of genetic variation that can be measured and analyzed and verified. The story is real. Its implications are real. We are what the bottleneck made us. And what it made us is strange. A species that's genetically one but culturally many. That adapts through learning rather than through biological evolution. That survives by cooperating in groups while competing between groups. That builds civilizations on foundations of Stone Age psychology. that's conscious enough to understand its own origins but still driven by drives and instincts shaped by evolutionary pressures from a vanished world. We're contradictions. Biological beings transcending biology through culture. Apes who teach and plan and imagine and create. Products of chance survival who now reshape the planet deliberately. The genetic bottleneck 200,000 years ago marked the moment we became this strange thing. Not immediately. The transformation took tens of thousands of years to play out fully. But the trajectory was set. The constraints were established. The genetic architecture was locked in place. Everything since has been cultural elaboration on that genetic foundation. Stone tools to space telescopes. Ochre crayons to digital art. What we've learned and what remains mysterious. We know human genetic diversity is remarkably low compared to other great apes. We know this diversity coalesces to a small population living roughly 200,000 years ago. We know mutation rates in the human lineage slowed compared to other primates. We know archaeological evidence shows cultural innovations accelerating during and after this period. We know other human species went extinct after modern humans appeared. We know global human populations expanded from Africa beginning around 70,000 years ago. These facts are established, verified by multiple independent research groups using different methodologies, published in peer-reviewed journals. As solid as scientific knowledge gets for events so deep in prehistory. But facts without connection are just data. The story we've been building connects these facts into a narrative. Small populations, near extinction, cultural adaptations, recovery and expansion, displacement of other human species, cultural evolution replacing genetic evolution. That narrative explains the facts. But is it true? Science doesn't deal in truth with capital T. It deals in models that fit available evidence. The bottleneck model fits. It explains low genetic diversity, mutation rate patterns, archaeological transitions, and population history in one coherent framework. But other models might also fit. Maybe genetic diversity is low for reasons that don't involve bottlenecks. Maybe cultural innovations happened independently of population size. Maybe the correlations we see are coincidental. Probably not. The convergence of genetic, archaeological, and paleoclimatic evidence pointing to crisis periods in human evolution is too consistent to be random chance. But uncertainty remains. The past doesn't preserve perfectly. Our data is fragmentary. Our methods have error bars. Our interpretations reflect current theoretical frameworks that future research might overturn. Everything we think we know about human origins is provisional, subject to revision as new evidence appears. This provisionality is important. It means we should hold these stories lightly, engage with them, find them fascinating, but recognize they're human constructs imposed on ambiguous evidence. The people who lived through the bottleneck didn't know they were in a bottleneck. Didn't know they were part of a dramatic evolutionary transition. Didn't know their survival would matter to descendants 10,000 generations later. They were just living, dealing with immediate problems, trying to eat and avoid danger and raise children and find meaning. Their subjective experience is forever lost. We can reconstruct their genetics, analyze their artifacts, model their populations, but we can't know what it felt like to be them, what they thought, what they valued, what stories they told themselves. This absence haunts every discussion of human origins. We're trying to understand humans through evidence that strips away humanity. Bones and genes and stones tell us about biology and behavior, but not about consciousness, not about experience, not about what it meant to be a person in that vanished world. Maybe this is why origin stories are universal in human cultures. Every society has myths explaining where people came from, how the world was made, why things are the way they are. These myths aren't science, but they serve functions science doesn't. They provide meaning, identity, connection to ancestors, a sense of place in cosmic order. The genetic bottleneck story we've been constructing has scientific validity, but it lacks the mythic resonance that makes stories matter to people emotionally. We could reframe it, tell it as a hero's journey, Humanity nearly destroyed but surviving through courage and innovation. Emerging transformed with new powers, culture, language, technology that enable conquest of the planet. This is emotionally satisfying. It makes us protagonists in our own story, but it's anthropomorphizing, imposing narrative structures on evolutionary processes that had no narrative. No protagonist, no climax, just populations responding to selection pressures over countless generations. The truth is less satisfying. Random demographic fluctuations pushed populations to critically low numbers. Some populations went extinct. Others persisted through chance and whatever adaptations they happened to have. Cultural practices that improved survival became more common because groups practicing them outlasted groups that didn't. Over time, this created a species with specific characteristics. Low genetic diversity, enhanced cultural learning, capacity for symbolic thought, not through design, through filtering. The populations that happened to have these features survived. The ones that didn't disappeared. There's no grand purpose, no destiny, no inherent meaning, just contingent survival followed by explosive success. We read meaning into it because we're the product of it and meaning-making is what we do. But the universe doesn't care. Evolution doesn't care. The bottleneck didn't happen for any reason except that conditions made it likely. Our survival didn't mean anything except we survived. Everything since all of human history and culture and civilization is consequence without plan. This perspective can feel nihilistic. If there's no grand purpose, why does anything matter? But actually it's liberating. If we're not following a cosmic script, if there's no predetermined path, then everything is possibility. We create meaning. We define purposes. We choose directions. The bottleneck didn't determine what humans would become. It only determined what we started from. A small founder population with specific genetic and cognitive characteristics. Everything built from that foundation was choice. Accumulation of countless individual and collective decisions. We created ourselves. We continue creating ourselves. The species that emerged from the bottleneck barely resembles us culturally even though we're genetically nearly identical. We've transformed ourselves through culture in ways that dwarf biological evolution. We'll continue transforming. Future humans might be as different from us culturally as we are from Upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherers. But they'll carry essentially the same genes, the same cognitive architecture, the same inheritance from the bottleneck. This continuity across discontinuity defines human existence. Biologically stable, culturally fluid, locked into genetic patterns established 200,000 years ago but creating endlessly varied ways of being human within those patterns. The bottleneck set the rules. We play infinite games within those rules. Each generation inventing new strategies, new technologies, new social forms, new arts, new ways of understanding, all built on the same genetic foundation, all variations on the theme established when a small population in Africa barely survived. That population, scattered across refugia, struggling through crisis conditions we can only imagine, had no idea what they were creating. They were just trying to survive. But their survival made everything since possible. Every human achievement, every culture, every idea, every work of art and act of love and moment of joy, all downstream from that bottleneck, all made possible by the genetic uniformity it created. In the final movement of this symphony of deep time, return once more to the central mystery. Not the bottleneck itself that seems well established, but what it means. What does it tell us about being human? What does it say about where we've been and where we're going? What insights hide in the genetic shadow of near-extinction? First, it reveals our fragility. We think of humans as robust, adaptable, dominant, and we are, in many ways. We've colonized every terrestrial environment, built civilizations that reshape the planet, develop technologies that extend our capabilities far beyond biological limits. But genetically we're fragile. One severe pandemic, one cascading environmental collapse, one nuclear war. Any of these could reduce human populations to bottleneck conditions again. And this time we might not recover because we're dependent on complex technological systems that small populations couldn't maintain. Our cultural sophistication hides biological vulnerability. We've built magnificent civilizations on foundations of remarkably low genetic diversity. This works brilliantly in stable conditions, but it creates systemic risk. All humans are similar enough that what affects one could affect all. Diseases that wouldn't spread in genetically diverse populations can become pandemics in ours. Environmental changes that would leave some variant populations unaffected could stress our entire species. We've specialized so heavily in cultural adaptation that we've lost biological resilience. Second, the bottleneck reveals our unity. All humans are related, not metaphorically, literally. We share recent common ancestors. Your ancestors and mine knew each other or knew people who knew each other during the bottleneck period. We're family in a much more direct sense than we usually acknowledge. The genetic evidence proves this. There are no fundamental biological differences between human populations. The variation that exists is superficial, recent, trivial in evolutionary terms. This should matter for how we treat each other. We divide ourselves by nationality, ethnicity, religion, ideology. These divisions feel fundamental. They drive conflicts that kill millions. But they're recent inventions, social constructs built on genetic uniformity. We're fighting family feuds, not species-level conflicts. Every war is civil war when you zoom out far enough. Every atrocity is fratricide. The people who seem most different from us genetically identical in all meaningful ways. Third, the bottleneck reveals our potential. We went from near-extinction to planetary dominance in 200,000 years. Evolutionary eye blink. This trajectory is unprecedented. No species has ever done anything comparable. We achieved it through culture, through the ability to accumulate knowledge across generations and share it across populations. This capacity emerged from or was enhanced by the genetic uniformity the bottleneck created. We're powerful because we're similar, because we can communicate, because we share cognitive frameworks that make cultural transmission efficient. This suggests we haven't peaked. Cultural evolution is still accelerating. The pace of change increases. Technologies develop faster. Scientific understanding deepens more rapidly. Social systems experiment with new forms. We're living through the continuation of the process that began with the bottleneck. The shift from genetic to cultural evolution. That process isn't complete. It might never complete. We might be at the beginning of something vast and strange, not the end. Fourth, the bottleneck reveals our responsibility. We didn't choose to become cultural beings. It was survival necessity during crisis conditions. But having become cultural beings, we're responsible for what we create. Our cultures aren't natural givens. They're human constructs, choices. If they produce suffering, that's our doing. If they produce flourishing, that's also our doing. We can't appeal to nature or evolution or divine mandate to justify cultural systems. They're ours. We made them. We can remake them. This is heavy. It means nothing is fixed. Nothing is inevitable. Every aspect of human civilization is contingent. Could be different. Could be better or worse. The responsibility for choosing is ours. The genetic bottleneck freed us from biological determinism but locked us into cultural responsibility. We have to decide what it means to be human because our genes won't decide for us. They provide constraints, basic drives, cognitive architecture. But vast space exists within those constraints for different ways of being. Fifth, and finally, the bottleneck reveals our strangeness. We're biological beings who transcend biology through culture. Animals who study ourselves scientifically. Apes who contemplate cosmic origins. Creatures who emerged from the same evolutionary processes as every other species but developed capacities that separate us categorically from them. This is weird, remarkable, almost impossible. Yet here we are, products of the bottleneck. Carriers of its legacy. The strangeness manifests in countless ways. We're the only species that knows it evolved. The only species that understands genetics and can read its own genome. The only species that reconstructs its own history through science. The only species that asks why it exists. These capacities don't make us better than other species in any moral sense. But they make us different, unique, alone with our specific form of consciousness. This loneliness might be the deepest consequence of the bottleneck. When other human species existed, when Neanderthals and Denisovans and Homo erectus shared the planet with us, human consciousness existed in multiple forms. Different types of minds experiencing the world differently. That diversity is gone. Only modern human consciousness remains. We have no mirrors. No one to compare ourselves against. No way to know what aspects of our experience are universal to consciousness and what aspects are peculiar to human neurology. We're trapped in our own perspective. Brilliant, creative, powerful, but ultimately limited to seeing the world through human eyes, thinking thoughts that human brains can think. The bottleneck narrowed the space of possible human consciousness to a single mode. We've explored that mode magnificently, built entire civilizations within it. But we can't escape it, can't know what we're missing, can't perceive the thoughts that other types of human minds might have thought. Maybe this is fine. Maybe our mode of consciousness is sufficient. Maybe we're not missing anything important. But maybe we are. Maybe other human species, had they survived, would have developed different sciences, different philosophies, different arts. Ways of understanding reality that we can't even imagine because they require neural architectures we don't have. We'll never know. The bottleneck ensured we'd be alone. Alone but successful. Strange but capable. Limited but powerful. This is what 200,000 years of evolution since the bottleneck has produced. This is what we are. As we reach the end, as sleep perhaps finally claims you, imagine one last scene. Morning light touching the eastern horizon of the Great Rift Valley. The place where, according to genetic and fossil evidence, modern humans emerged. The landscape hasn't changed fundamentally in 200,000 years. Same geological formations. Same patterns of vegetation, though species have shifted. Same sunrise, though the particular morning is unique. Somewhere in this landscape, or one very like it, a person woke up for the first time fully conscious in the way we understand consciousness. Aware of being aware, capable of abstract thought, able to imagine futures and reconstruct pasts. Human in the complete sense. We don't know who they were. We don't know when exactly the transition happened. Consciousness doesn't fossilize. It leaves no artifacts except behavior, and behavior can be ambiguous. But it happened. Somewhere, sometime, human cognition crossed a threshold, became something qualitatively different from what came before. The genetic bottleneck created the conditions that made this transition possible. Or maybe triggered it. Or maybe coincided with it randomly. The causation isn't clear, but the correlation is undeniable. That person, whoever they were, was the first to experience being human as we experience it. The first to look at stars and wonder what they were. The first to contemplate death and seek meaning in it. The first to create art not just for function but for beauty. The first to tell stories. The first to see themselves as part of a larger narrative. They were us. The beginning of an unbroken chain of consciousness that leads to everyone alive today. What they thought we'll never know. What they felt remains mystery. But they survived. Somehow, despite impossible odds, despite population numbers that should have led to extinction, despite genetic diversity that left the species vulnerable, they survived. Had children, passed on genes and culture, started the process that led to everything since. Cities, science, art, philosophy, all downstream from one small population hanging on in East Africa during the bottleneck period. The improbability of our existence should stagger us. So many ways it could have failed. So many points where extinction was likelier than survival. Yet here we are. Billions of descendants of a founder population that numbered in the thousands. We succeeded. Not through inevitability or destiny, but through contingent survival. The universe didn't plan for humans to exist. Evolution didn't aim toward us. We're an accident that happened to persist. But what a magnificent accident. From that small, genetically impoverished population emerged the species that dominates Earth. that sends probes to other planets, that decodes the genome, that builds vast civilizations, that creates art and science and philosophy, all built on the foundation laid during the bottleneck, all made possible by adaptations forged in crisis, all testament to the power of cultural evolution to transcend genetic limitations. The genetic data forces us to accept something uncomfortable. We're not special biologically. Genetically, we're impoverished compared to other great apes. Vulnerable in ways they aren't. Limited in ways they aren't. What makes us special is culture. The elaboration of knowledge and technology and social organization that we build on top of our genes. Strip away culture and we're